I know you love earning travel rewards and cash back, and that's why you're going to love Rakuten. With Rakuten, you can earn cash back on everything you need to book your dream trip, hotels, flights, rental cars, experiences, and more, while still booking through your favorite travel sites. And don't worry, cash back can be earned on top of earning the credit card points and the hotel and airline loyalty points that matter most to you, depending on how you make your booking. Plus, with Rakuten, you can also earn cash back on groceries and other purchases like electronics, pet supplies, and more. And the best part, you can join today for free and start earning cash back on top of your travel rewards. Go to Rakuten.com or get the app. That's Rakuten, Rakuten. Rakuten, the most rewarding way to shop.
Even from when I was very young, I saw travel not just as a thing that you would do to like go on holiday, but that you could actually go out and live and work and learn so much about being in a different place. I went to see a few people in Yangon, including the UN agency, the International Labour Organization, who they told me about the practice of forced labor and how that had happened everywhere. So I had an inkling of what I might find in the South, but beyond that, I really, really didn't know what I was going to come across.
That is today's guest, Clare Hammond, who is an award-winning investigative journalist whose reporting has appeared in publications like The Guardian, NPR, and The Economist. Clare spent nearly 7 years living in Myanmar, and while she was working as a journalist there, she discovered an obscure map showing a network of railways across Myanmar that weren't on any other publicly available maps. This compelled her to go on a 3-month journey across the country, traveling these mysterious railways to uncover their purpose and reveal the stories surrounding them. Her investigation took 5 years to complete and formed the basis of her book On the Shadow Tracks, A Journey Through Occupied Myanmar. And that's the core of this conversation today. You'll discover the hidden history of Myanmar's mysterious railway network. We're going to talk about how Clare's journey across Myanmar revealed stories of resilience in communities that have endured decades of oppression, how the complex legacy of British colonialism set the stage for many of Myanmar's current conflicts, what life is really like there, and loads more. This conversation will give you a rare glimpse into a place that few journalists have documented in such depth. Let's dive in. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey, it's Jason here with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here and letting me bring a little travel into your ears today. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. Clare Hammond is our guest. She is currently the senior investigator for the nonprofit Global Witness, investigating issues related to natural resources, conflict, and corruption. You can learn more about that important organization over at globalwitness.org. Of course, Clare's website is clarehammond.net. You can find out about her and her work there, and the book, as I mentioned at the top, On the Shadow Tracks, A Journey Through Occupied Myanmar. I find the work of investigative journalists like Clare to be some of the most important work being done, and I'm truly inspired by somebody who commits so much time and energy trying to bring stories to light, and doing that by actually getting on the ground and talking to the people in a place and really giving us the truth, the facts. And that's something we always need in this world. We need real facts, real truth, and we need the people out there that are willing to dive in and get that and share it with us. And that is so inspiring to me, that type of work. And I really admire Claire's work, and to all of the journalists out there working hard to uncover truths and stories and to report them. Thank you. I'm going to dive into this one now. Don't forget, by the way, zerototravel.com/newsletter. We have a free newsletter, goes out once a week over there. I write it, and it's a great way to keep in touch off the pod. Thank you so much for listening. Please enjoy my conversation with Claire. I'll leave you with a quote at the end, and I'll see you on the other side. Cheers. Clare Hammond, welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Jason. It's great to be on the show.
You're in London, from what my understanding, right?
I am indeed in sunny Peckham, southeast London.
Okay. Yeah. Is that where you grew up?
It's not. I grew up in Sussex on the south coast. It's the nearest beach to London. It's like an hour and a half south.
So how does a gal from a beach town in England become an investigative journalist living in Myanmar and Hong Kong and these other places that it's brought you? How does that happen?
It's a really good question. I was actually asked in an interview last week about my journey, and I've been thinking about it a little bit the past few days. I think it dates back to the very moment of my existence, in that when I was yeah, I don't know how you describe that. If you're like an embryo, or I should probably know this, I've just had a bunch of kids, like a fertilized egg. I was in Zambia because my parents, when they left medical school, they went there to work as doctors. And so my mom became pregnant with me out there. She realized that she was pregnant actually because she got malaria. It's not like over here when you have all the tests and the scans and things. It's like, okay, you've got malaria, so your immune system is probably down. Let's go and have a look. And yeah, so they were living out there, and they came back to London when I was born. But when I was growing up, they'd always bring out these like really old-fashioned slides and projectors, and would show us all of these incredible photos from their life out there. They lived out there for a couple of years. And so even from when I was very young, I saw travel not just as a thing that you would do to like go on holiday, but that you could actually go out and live and work and learn so much about being in a different place, just kind of upping and leaving, which is what they did with a couple of suitcases. And throughout my life, my dad has kind of carried on going off and doing that. When I was a young teenager, he went to go and work in Kazakhstan and in Russia. I didn't really know much about what he was doing. And then he reoriented his job, so he became a flight doctor, which meant that he was based at home, but he would get to travel for work every few weeks. And they'd work for big companies, I guess, like the BBC and others. And if people got injured, then they'd go out and figure out how to get them home or to get them medical care out there. And since he's retired, he's started working for the last like 5 or 6 years for Doctors Without Borders, working in lots of different countries. So that I think in the back of my mind was always an inspiration. And I started traveling as soon as I could, really. Our summer holidays were pretty boring, but when I had my first chance, which was university, I went to Ireland, which isn't that far away from the UK, but historically and culturally, it's very different. I'm actually half Irish, and when I was there, I sort of had my eyes open to a lot of this troubled history that I didn't really know about when I was in the UK. And I started to realize that you can learn a lot more about the world, and including about the place where you're from, when you're at a distance from it. And I think it was during those years that I began to think, wow, this is really great. This is fascinating, and this is the way I want to start living my life. Traveling around and learning about places by immersing yourself in those places, and then learning about the history there, and then more broadly learning about how that connects to your own history back home. And so straight out of university, my first job was, as you mentioned, was in Hong Kong as a journalist.
So you studied journalism in school?
I didn't actually. I studied literature. My interest in journalism has come through an interest in writing. And it was travel writing that kind of led me to an interest in journalism, because a lot of travel writing is effectively reportage. So no, I managed to get a job after university. I'd actually been at university for about 5 years, and I didn't really have any money left to carry on studying. So I got on a graduate trainee program in journalism. And this was just after the financial crisis, and there weren't that many grad trainee programs running at the time. And the one that I got on was in financial journalism, which I knew absolutely nothing about. I remember buying a book called Finance for Dummies and trying to brush up for the interview. They sent me out to Hong Kong, and it was a year of really, really intense journalism training, partly on the job. So it was a big financial publication, and you would spend kind of dawn till dusk in the newsrooms on the phone to bankers, trying to get details of deals and to break news. So we'd often have, I think we'd need to file like 2 or more stories a day. And so you're kind of racing around. And that was how I learned how to be a reporter, and something about financial markets as well.
I mean, it's pretty incredible to think about, starting from that point and actually like putting together well thought out articles that other financial professionals are going to read. Yeah, you're kind of like, throw you into the deep end and see if you can swim kind of thing.
Yeah, there was one really, really mortifying moment when I must have been about 23 or 24, and I was in one of those huge high-rise buildings in Hong Kong where the banks are, on like the 36th floor, talking to this quite intense Chinese banker about the bond markets. And halfway through, he was like, you don't know what you're asking me, do you? And I had to say, you're quite right. I have absolutely no idea what I was asking you in the last couple of questions that I just asked. But they were kind. I mean, I think I was young enough that everyone was generally willing to help me learn. And you do have to learn quite quickly in an environment like that.
I mean, I can, as somebody who's, carrying conversations with a lot of people, I feel like, there's a kinship between you and I in that interview portion, at least, right? Where you just kind of, you have to make somebody feel comfortable, but also, you're there to kind of get some certain information. In that case, it's important to write about bonds in that case, but it's not like you can know everything about everything all the time. It's not an easy trick to pull off.
No, absolutely. And that is the journalist skill. And gradually you realize that actually you can, I mean, it's such a great joy that you can learn about the world through asking questions. And if you can do it about something really obscure and technical like bonds, then suddenly all sorts of other things open up that you start piecing together the story by asking those questions. And that's really exciting.
We're going to obviously transition at some point to your time in Myanmar and the book that you wrote, which we're going to talk about, of course. Yeah, I should mention the book, On the Shadow Tracks, A Journey Through Occupied Myanmar. At what point did you, because you mentioned kind of wanting to travel, get out into the world and kind of immerse yourself in as a way to learn the place, about a place. But then your focus kind of shifted to this investigative journalism and really investigating these issues related to a place, and specifically now natural resources, conflict, and corruption, which, I would say the average traveler is more focused on, let's see, let's learn a bit about like some of the positive aspects of this culture and let's try to understand this place, but maybe not going super deep into some of the issues, which can be difficult as a traveler, right? You're just passing through. You're kind of like, you're trying to understand a place, but you can only really understand so much as somebody from outside of a country. So for you, when did it shift to be interested more in the sort of, I guess, those underpinnings of government and society and the things that maybe most people that are passing through a place aren't going to focus on? The complex issues.
The complex issues, yeah. I think it happened because when I think it's probably because of my start as a journalist in reporting on financial markets, which wasn't really through my own choice. When I went to Myanmar, I was still very much in the mind frame of you slightly need to know about something to write about it. I wasn't like, at the time when I moved there, the country was opening up. There were these really, really exciting reforms that were happening. So Myanmar had been one of the world's most repressive states for about half a century. And there were these political and economic reforms that were seeing Aung San Suu Kyi, who's a democracy icon, Nobel laureate, was eventually voted into power. And lots of young journalists from around the world were coming with no experience to report on this story, to try and make a name by reporting on this huge political story. And they were following this. And I was a bit nervous about doing that. I was like, okay, I've only done financial journalism. So if I want to make the transition to writing about the really interesting stuff, I need to do it incrementally. So I got myself a job as a business reporter, as a business editor at the Myanmar Times, which is the country's national newspaper. It no longer exists. And so the type of stories that I was writing about, like, not many people were reporting on them. And the more I started reporting, the more I was like, wow, there's this whole fascinating side of the Myanmar story that isn't getting very much attention. And it was to a degree, but the story of the democratic transition kind of eclipsed it. And just to give a sort of brief summary of the kind of stories, and I was really reporting on the tip of the iceberg, but Myanmar is home to some of the world's longest civil conflicts. And it has this huge illicit economy that dwarfs the formal economy. And it's one of the world's largest producers of narcotics. So it contends with Afghanistan for being one of the world's largest producers of opium and heroin. And it's one of the world's largest producers of methamphetamines. And there's this insanely complex patchwork of militia groups that the military has signed ceasefires with over the decades. And in return for them giving up arms or putting their arms away, maybe to be brought out again later, then they would sign these deals to allow them to conduct basically any kind of business activity that they wanted to in their territory. So you had this landscape of all of these tiny narco states, basically, and then they would launder the money from drugs and guns through the formal economy. So that would be, Myanmar's very, very resource rich. So it's the world's largest source of jade. It's China's main supplier of jade, and the Chinese really value jade. It's the world's largest supplier of rubies and sapphires and teak and other hardwoods. And so you'd have all of this illicit capital that would be laundered through natural resources, and then that would all be laundered again through the formal economy. So when I was working there, you had this crazy situation where Myanmar's a very poor country, but all of these high-end condominiums and hotels and luxury developments were springing up all over Yangon and to a degree other cities. Yangon is the commercial capital, the largest city where I lived. And so I was reporting these business stories like new condominium opens or, things that on the surface would be very dry. But then trying to dig into who owned them and where the money came from. And I slowly just found myself getting sucked into this crazy world where you couldn't really find anything out because these weren't normal businesses and it was a cash economy. So you'd go down to report on the opening of these luxury condominiums and everybody would be showing up with bags of cash to buy them. And if you wanted to report on these stories, you find yourself becoming an investigative journalist. Like you can't just, report on the statements the companies are putting out and look at their kind of shareholders and check that everything adds up. It doesn't work like that. And once you start digging, then it leads you to the conflicts as well and the human rights abuses. And it's like pulling on a string. And that's kind of what I was then digging into while everybody else was reporting on the political story, which really was the big international story at the time.
We'll get back to the interview in just a moment. I know you love earning travel rewards and cash back, and that's why you're going to love Rakuten. With Rakuten, you can earn cash back on everything you need to book your dream trip, hotels, flights, rental cars, experiences, and more, while still booking through your favorite travel sites. And don't worry, cash back can be earned on top of earning the credit card points and the hotel and airline loyalty points that matter most to you, depending on how you make your booking. Plus, with Rakuten, you can also earn cash back on groceries and other purchases like electronics, pet supplies, and more. And the best part, you can join today for free and start earning cash back on top of your travel rewards. Go to Rakuten.com or get the app. That's Rakuten, Rakuten. Rakuten, the most rewarding way to shop. Now, back to the show. Okay, just thinking about, because you could have churned out these, I don't want to call them puff pieces, but these sort of surface level articles and then gone about, having whatever travel experiences you want. But you're choosing to dig deeper into a world that, you have to have a sense of, okay, this could like personally be dangerous for you, because when people come around and they're asking questions and they're asking too many questions and they're starting to unravel the spool of thread or whatever metaphor you want to use, that can cause problems. And I'm just curious because I haven't talked to too many people who have sort of willingly put themselves into harm's way in that way, from like an investigative journalist kind of perspective and mindset. And like, you know what, I'm just going to keep pushing forward because this is a story that needs to be heard, but did you think about your personal safety? Did you kind of ever consider like, maybe I shouldn't be, this goes deeper and deeper and we'll get into the work you did in the book and everything. This was just this was the beginning of it sounds like, for you. Where did you rank your personal safety at this time?
Jason, I will say that a lot of these stories are still untold. There were a lot where I thought, it's not worth doing this. And we'll touch on the book a bit in a minute. I figured in some cases there were other ways to tell the story, and that was looking at the human impact of what all of this sort of the illicit economy was driving, and how that impacted real people's lives. And so a lot of the time I decided that was a better and a safer way to tell the story, not just for me, but for the people who I was working with. I will also say that I ended up living in Myanmar for a really long time. I was there for nearly 7 years. And I started out by writing these, sometimes I did write kind of puff piecey stories. That was just a very focused story about something that had happened at the tip of this kind of iceberg. And then gradually, I started building up my understanding of risk, I guess. I went on a few trips, a few reporting trips with Burmese colleagues. And, of course, I learned so much from my colleagues, and they knew where you could go, where you couldn't go, the questions you could and couldn't ask. And I think by working with them on a lot of stories, I mean, I was working for a daily newspaper for 2 years. And so we covered a lot. And you do get a pretty good sense of where the no-go areas are, or where you would need to use other ways of storytelling. I've done since some pieces that look at satellite imagery to tell a story, and there you're not really putting yourself out there in harm's way. I will also say that at the time I was working in Myanmar, the risk for a foreign journalist was much lower than for Myanmar Burmese reporter. And so there was a sense that and this has changed since there was a military coup in the country in 2021. And after that, foreigners were arrested. But at the time, the worst thing that had happened to a foreign journalist in the country was that they would be deported. And that was the go-to response by the military. In terms of digging into the shady dealings of ethnic armed groups and militias, I didn't go too far down that route. So I was always very, very aware of the risk analysis that I needed to do before and while working on the story, particularly stories like this.
Kind of like jumping in the cold water and getting used to it after a while. I guess you just kind of, your risk tolerance goes up. But even still, the standard policy may have been to deport, but that doesn't mean that somebody wouldn't be arrested and made an example of, for example. And
No,
that was a
absolutely.
risk, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, the way that the Myanmar military has operated, they have extremely vague laws on their books that are supposed to deter people from holding them to account. And so you could be arrested for something that you didn't think was risky at all. And so I don't know whether it had the desired effect or whether people were just so used to sort of living with that risk and reporting, knowing that that was always a risk, that they would then do things that were bolder perhaps than they would if there were very clear red lines around what you could and couldn't do.
Is Myanmar a place that you could travel to now, that you would say, okay, yeah, somebody wants to go in and they want to experience this place as it is right now?
I would say no, given that there was a military coup in 2021, and since then, resistance groups all across the country have been fighting the military to overthrow it. On the other hand, I was talking to a friend who runs a responsible tourism company there. He said a lot of people are traveling to the country. You have quite an absurd situation where Myanmar has these very photogenic places, including the temples of Bagan, and they are Instagrammed a lot. And you have a lot of people showing up, my friend said, who know nothing about the political crisis, know nothing about the conflict, but have seen these temples on Instagram and want to go there and take photographs. And the other thing that I would say is that even when we were living in the country as foreign journalists, that there aren't really any who are operating openly there now. And at the time it was politically acceptable to be there and to be traveling, there was still the same kinds of conflicts and human rights abuses taking place. And there was a genocide in 2016, 2017, which is still ongoing to a degree, of the Rohingya Muslim minority. And at the time, there were lots of tourists traveling, even to Rakhine State, where it was happening in the south. There were some really beautiful beaches. And so there's always been this question around whether it's all right to travel to the peaceful parts of Myanmar when just out of sight you have awful human rights abuses taking place against, particularly against minority groups, but also just against civilians by the Burmese military. In the 1990s, Aung San Suu Kyi had advocated for a travel ban, and I think in a way that ban and the reluctance of people to go there and see the country contributed to its isolation and the facilitation of widespread abuses that weren't really documented or known about outside the country. So it's a really complex question that I don't have the answer to, but I think since the coup in 2021, broadly, most people in Myanmar who are still fighting against the military would say now is not the right time to travel in the country.
Yeah. Okay. It amazes me to hear that people will just see something on Instagram and literally not look into anything. That's almost unbelievable. But you're saying it happens, so I believe you.
It happens. And people can just,
it's just like, all right, you don't need to be an investigative journalist like Claire to just, look up a few things before you. Okay, sorry.
Indeed.
Rant
Indeed.
over. A friend of mine, Dustin Main, I'm not sure if you're aware of Dustin. He did a 5-year documentary photo project called This Myanmar Life. I can link up to it. But I also asked him when I was pulling some questions together for this interview, like, yeah, what would you ask Claire? So some of these questions are mine. Some of these were inspired by his. But I did want to get a sense of where the genesis for the book began for you, finding this sort of hidden railway and then deciding to explore it. Can you just share the story behind all of that and the crux of the book?
Absolutely. It was soon after the 2015 election when Aung San Suu Kyi had been voted into power and she had just formed a government. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. I'd been in Myanmar for a couple of years. I'd saved up a bit of money and I was thinking about doing some travel, particularly because I had pretty much been stuck in the newsroom editing stories that were filed from other people all across the country. And I hadn't had that much of a chance, apart from a couple of reporting trips, to see much of Myanmar myself. I'd been to the sort of tourist areas, the beaches and the temples that began, like I'd mentioned, but a lot of the places that my colleagues have been reporting on, I really wanted to go to. And it just so happened that around that time, I was reading through this pretty obscure policy paper by the Asian Development Bank. They had been working with Myanmar's railway ministry to digitize a lot of its paper records, because there was this information vacuum about what had happened in those decades of military rule. And so for the first time, all of this information was coming out about what had been happening, including very basic details about what the military regime had been doing. And part of this report, the report was all about the finances of the railway ministry, which were atrocious. And it was also about these railway lines that the military regime run by a general called Than Shwe, who ruled the country for around 20 years. They had started building these railway lines all over the country from the 1990s. And there was this map that showed the extent of the railway network. And I'd done a bit of traveling by train. I lived near the central railway station in Yangon, and I often walked through it on my way to and from work, and I had a pretty good idea of the timetables. And that was really only a few railways that had been built by the British, but this map showed that there was something like another 3,000 miles of railway that had been built by the military regime since the 90s. But nobody knew anything about them. And I started asking my colleagues, and they had no idea that these lines had even been built. Which is bizarre, completely bizarre to me, because that sort of thing doesn't happen in the UK. And just for your listeners who are thinking, that doesn't sound realistic, Myanmar under military rule had no independent journalists, no civil society groups, no internet or even mobile phones. So it was 2014 when there was the fastest infrastructure rollout in history. Basically, everybody got a mobile for the first time and everyone got connected to the internet for the first time. So things that had happened before then, people didn't really know about it unless they happened to be there when it was happening. And even information didn't really get shared between different parts of the country because the infrastructure was so bad, actually, until the railways were built, that Myanmar's covered in jungle. And so there was no kind of national understanding or knowledge about things that had happened. So it was this strange environment in which a nationwide railway network could be built, and there was no information about it online, and nobody really knew about it. So there I was thinking, okay, I really want to travel around the country. It's opening up to travel for the first time in its modern history, because now there was partial civilian rule, and places where these railways were, I'm thinking, for example, in the very far south of the country, there hadn't been tourists there since the Second World War. And I began to see that this map would be, and investigating what had happened would be a really good way to get out and travel and to learn something in the process. I didn't really know what I was going to find. There was a little bit of information online, testimonies relating, particularly in the South, to mass forced labor for building these railways. And I went to see a few people in Yangon, including the UN agency, the International Labour Organization, who they told me about the practice of forced labor and how that had happened everywhere. So I had an inkling of what I might find in the South, but beyond that, I really, really didn't know what I was going to come across. So it was exciting.
Was this all self-funded, this project?
Yeah, it was. Travel in Myanmar, luckily, is really cheap, particularly if you're traveling by train. So that was also very convenient.
Yeah. So how did this look in practice? I mean, so you're looking at this map and you have this extensive network of railways that nobody really knows what it is. You have a minor inkling of what it may be in the South, but and now you're heading out the door. I mean, what was your kind of plan? How did things unfold for you? What did you discover? We encourage people to check out the book to dive in to really go on the journey with you. But how did you kind of piece it all together?
It's a good question. I say I didn't find out that much in Yangon before I went. I did quite a lot of planning around how I'd get to different places, around where I could and couldn't travel, where I would need permissions, because some parts of the country were still off limits unless you had official permission. I did a lot of mapping of guest houses and places that accepted foreigners, because Myanmar had, I imagine it still has, this rule where if you're a foreigner, you can only stay in a licensed hotel. You can't just stay at somebody's house. And in some parts of the country, there weren't that many places where foreigners could stay. And I also tried as much as I could to figure out where I had contacts in different parts of the country. And it really helped that I was working for a national newspaper, because I had colleagues in different places. So I sort of had vague plans to check in with different people at different points. And then I had the map and the plan to just follow the map around. And I think initially I was planning to write something a bit lighter than the book that I ended up writing, which has moments of light relief, but deals with some pretty dark episodes in Myanmar's history and in Britain's history too. And I flew first to the south. I mean, I needed somewhere to start, and I was just going to follow the map around clockwise. The south made sense because I had the most contacts there and the most information about what had happened there. And I set up interviews. I wasn't really sure. It's ended up being quite a hybrid book. I wasn't really sure the degree to which it was going to be a travel book and the degree to which it was going to be a piece of investigative journalism. I took notes on everything. So I have like loads of notebooks filled with details about the incredible journeys by train, which I loved. And I ended up having to cut quite a lot of that. But I would just ask the same really basic questions everywhere I turned up, which would be, tell me about the history of the railway here. And different things, people in different parts of the country associated the railways with different things. And so they would kind of assume that I was asking about that thing. So by starting with a really open question, they would then, in the South, start talking about forced labor and how the military in the 1990s, there had been an uprising a few years earlier, and they'd realized that they didn't have a very good grip on the country, and all of the borderlands are covered in jungle and were home to insurgent groups. And so in the 90s, they went out to different parts of the country, not just the south, but also up near the Indian border and in the east near the Chinese border and down towards Thailand. And they would go into villages where mostly inhabited by ethnic minority groups, and often they didn't speak Burmese, but they would force one person from every household to go to a site in the jungle, bring their own food and their own tools, build their own shelters, and people often slept on the ground, and by hand build these railways through the jungle, which were designed to give access to Myanmar's military and its troops. And when the railways were finished, and the railway building took place at the same time as campaigns against ethnic armed groups, and when the railways were finished, then the military would build bases and other kind of infrastructure along the lines to fortify the lines and establish their control. So people in those parts of the country, when you say, tell me about the history of the railway, obviously we'll start talking about that. And then in other parts of the country that were already under state control, there were all these other kinds of stories that came out. I mean, on the banks of the Irrawaddy River, which is Myanmar's largest river, the military had built this railway line to connect its weapons factories because it was kind of building this nationwide supply chain that would enable it to crush insurgencies more effectively, in theory. But they didn't really know very much about engineering, so they built this railway along the bank of the river, which blocked the flow of all of the waterways into the river. And so the railway acted as a dam, and every year during the monsoon, then there'd be huge flooding in all of the villages along the route, and people died because of this. So there, for example, I'd mentioned the railway, and that's what people would talk about, or land rights. Often, government contractors would just turn up and start bulldozing land, and people realized they'd lost their farms and their livelihood. So that was kind of how it went. And as I traveled, people began to also talk about Britain's railway building project in Myanmar and the British colonial occupation of Myanmar, which lasted for 120 years until 1948, so longer than the country has been independent. And I realized as I had these conversations how little I knew about that period of British history. And so that led me back eventually to the archives in Britain to learn about a project that had been remarkably similar to the one that Myanmar's military had carried out all of those decades later. And so the book also became about looking at that history and its after effects, particularly in Myanmar's borderlands, because they're places that have not ever been fully integrated into the Myanmar state.
We'll get back to the interview in just a moment. Now, back to the show. Dustin, who I mentioned earlier, had a question that I just have to hat tip him on this one because I hadn't thought of it this way. But he had mentioned wanting to get your opinion on, former British occupied territories. What is it about British colonies that make them so ripe for conflict?
It's a really good question. I think in this...
I thought so too.
Thanks, Dustin. In the case of Myanmar, I can't speak more broadly, but I think that similar things happened in different parts of the British colonies. I mean, of course they did. I just don't know them in such depth as what happened in Myanmar. But what the British did is they invaded different independent territories. So the territory that's known as modern Myanmar today is actually home to more than 100 different groups of people. There's the Burmese at the center, and that was the Burmese kingdom. But then in the west, you've got what was the Rakhine kingdom, in the east, the Mon, and then lots of different tribal groups around the northern borderlands in a kind of horseshoe shape. And the British invaded at different points over that 120-year period, and they just kind of welded those territories together. And some cases physically with railway lines, which is what they did in other parts of the world. In some cases, in terms of administration, they would just govern these territories together, but they didn't even do that much to try and unify. The way that they governed the highlands was different to the way that they governed the lowlands. So they had all of these territories that were sort of pulled together under, it was actually British India. So even what's Myanmar today was kind of welded on to British India. And then they would divide for reasons, I think, of administrative convenience. They would divide all the peoples into different groups. And so by the end of the empire, it was a collection of peoples who felt that they had very different and fixed racial identities and were obviously very aware of their different histories. And a lot of them had proud histories of being independent states. And then independence happened in a hurry, as happened in a lot of former British colonies around the time of the Second World War. And Britain just said, actually, we can't handle this anymore. So you guys deal with it. And in the case of Myanmar, they gave power back to the Burmese independence leaders in Yangon. Yangon is in the far south of the country. And they were given control over this vast territory that was much, much bigger than the original Burmese kingdom. And so obviously in the year after independence, a whole bunch of different conflicts broke out. And that was kind of the way that the British did it in other parts of the world as well. I think, it was partly just because the empire was so enormous and they needed to lump territories together in order to administer them effectively.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Yeah. So you're traveling around, and when you're hearing these stories from an individual, like somebody who got threatened, had to leave their home, build their own shelter, and be away from their family to build a railroad, or some of these other, I'm sure you've got some other examples to share. It can be pretty heavy, very emotional. I'm just curious for you personally, like, how did you handle that part of the job as you saw it? I mean, you were choosing to go on this experience, of course, as you mentioned, it was self-funded. You wanted to look into this, you wanted to explore this and ask these questions. I just quickly want to say I applaud you for that, because it's not something, if these stories aren't told by you, they're probably not told, the ones in this book. So thank you for that. But, on a personal level and emotional level, how did you do that? What was that like for you?
I think I took my cue from the people who I was speaking with. And these are people who have had to deal with very heavy things their whole lives. And they often described the abuses that they had suffered in relation to the railway building as just part of a broader pattern of what had happened. And I was amazed by how resilient people were. And often when I sat down for these conversations, and sometimes the story would be told in a morning, sometimes it would be told over a few days. But people would want to talk about all kinds of other things. And what I learned from them was how these things that had happened to them were they'd absorbed them into a very rich and resilient life. And so often you'd break for a long time for a meal and to talk about all kinds of things that were completely irrelevant to the military and what it had done. And people were showing me that was part of their lives and an important part of their lives, but not the defining part of their lives. And so for me, that cushioned the emotional intensity of it. And I guess that's what people were doing for themselves as well.
Can you share a couple individual stories that you heard that really stick with you to this day?
The one that's coming to my mind is one that I've already mentioned, which is about the railway line that was acting as a dam and blocking the flow of water to the river. And we'd gone to this part of the country. It's a very closed part of the country. It's where the military built its weapons factories, because the military feels like that's its kind of stronghold. It's now being threatened since the coup, and it's always been run like a kind of fiefdom, like other parts of the country, by a military crony. And I'd gone there with a journalist who's from that region. He's one of just 4 journalists in the whole region. And we'd been going along the railway line from village to village. And we were invited in by all of the village elders to one of these villages, and they'd set out on this platform these flasks of tea and cake in plastic packets. We were always treated to tea and cake wherever I went, which was a very lovely thing to do for a stranger who's just passing through. And we sort of wandered around the village, and they showed me where the contractors had bored this hole in the railway embankment to try and let the water flow through. But it meant that every year in the monsoon, instead of flowing into the river, then the floodwaters would just flow straight into their village. And they had this huge kind of chasm that had gone through the center of the village. And we just stood there on the edge of it, and it went off round into a copse of trees. And I said, have there been any accidents? And they were all just silent for ages. And then the village head said, last year we lost our treasure. And it was a young boy, age 7, who had been struggling against the current, trying to get to school. And I think that epitomized for me the futility of the losses that were associated with this railway. That specific railway wasn't even functioning. It had never functioned. And the same thing in other parts of the country. So when you had mass forced labor and millions of people were forced to work, even when I was there 15 years later, those railways were receding into the jungle and nobody was really using them. I think more broadly, it just reflects the futility of the nation-building project in Myanmar, and what you see happening in the country now is resistance to that by not just armed groups. These are not hardened fighters. These are people like the people in those villages who had just had enough, because there was no recourse to justice, and that's why you see that part of the country has been one of the sites of the fiercest resistance since the coup, because they're saying, we can't tolerate this any longer.
Oh, heartbreaking.
Sorry, yeah, that's a really sad one.
It's one of the most important things about storytelling, right? Is like you have to bring the headlines to life. You can think of a 7-year-old just trying to get to school. It's hard when the issues are so complex as sort of the average person living in the world is just kind of, there's these resistance and fighting and all that stuff. And it just kind of can become a blur of headlines, right? Like, it's not like you forget that there's actual individual humans that are behind this. It's difficult. So that's why it's like, I think it's so important for these stories to be told. And hearing stories like this and hearing, I don't know the word. I guess like how much a government or a military or, anywhere in the world when they can just take control and kind of do whatever they want, and how that can just impact sort of ordinary citizens just trying to live their lives, and how heartbreaking, how that can lead to so many heartbreaking situations all over the world constantly happening. Having like seen a part of the world and bearing witness to this and had these conversations, I mean, how has that impacted your view of the world?
I think the main thing that I've realized from this journey and from writing this book, and particularly looking at the links between the British colonial project in Myanmar and what the military has done, is how systemic some of these problems and these abuses are. And I never studied the theory. I kind of saw it from the ground up. And then when I did start reading around the subject, I was like, wow, this stuff that's happening in Myanmar. I mean, of course, the military are responsible, but it's part of a much bigger picture. And my work at the organization where I work for, I'm looking into mining and conflict and the links between conflict, investment, human rights abuses in other parts of the world, and it's really, really similar, the things that are happening, and people get caught up in something that's so much bigger than themselves, and that I think has been quite difficult for me to come to terms with. Within that, I've been constantly amazed and encouraged, inspired, galvanized by the examples of how people resist and how people can thrive even within those circumstances. And the lives that people were living, the people I came across, so many of them were so, like, you would imagine, given all of the things that had happened to them, that they'd be pretty down in the dumps, and they weren't. And even now, we just touched on this, like, everyone's organizing themselves, everybody's fighting, and everyone's like, no, this is not okay, we're not going to live like that. And that was amazing to see again and again and again. And the stories were different, but that was very much the common theme. And that's hopeful.
That's where you hang your hope, I guess, is the resilience.
I think so. And the ability of people to organize. For all the problems that the internet has brought to Myanmar, I mean, the Rohingya genocide was one of the first examples of mass violence that happened because of what happened on Facebook. The internet has enabled people in all sorts of different parts of the country to come together and to resist together. And I think that represents some hope as well, in a way that they never could.
What happened directly to social media that caused the violence?
It was disinformation by Myanmar's military. But then it was also, gosh, it's complex. But basically, a narrative was built online about how the Rohingya were interlopers. There was a lot of very, very nasty racist content being shared that then Myanmar got to a point where people had accepted that the Rohingya were deserving of violence, and then real life attacks were carried out. So it was the kind of desensitization of a population to violence. It's a huge tragedy.
I mean, on the one hand, you have the systemic, like you said, these systemic issues that can be seems so big and overwhelming and defeating. On the other hand, you know that there are systems in place in societies that work well, and so that means it's a solvable thing too, systemically solvable, which is encouraging. But with these big questions, it's always like what comes down to you're an individual, two individuals here. How do you solve a systemic thing that's such a big problem? But the answer is always people, right?
Yep,
Like
absolutely.
people getting out and doing stuff and coming together. And, maybe if there's a call to action here for people listening or whatever, like any one of us can be those people that are rallying or organizing on a local level, on a community level. We have to remind ourselves of that sometimes, I think.
Yeah. We're not just consumers. We are also communities.
I mean, a lot of governments want us to just be consumers, but that's another question. Well, it's eternally frustrating that there can be, these now trillion-dollar organizations or, multi-billion-dollar at least that, I mean, will take like a social media company or something like that they're so good at systems that they've been able to systemize a business to a level where it's worth billions and billions, and it's all engineered towards keeping our attention in this example. And like maybe we could use some of those brains, some of that intellect, some of that systems driven thinking to solve some of these bigger problems. I don't know, like, eternally frustrating. Well, the misinformation thing, I mean, how much of media is misinformation? That's a hard question to answer, but I mean, maybe you can give us an education having been involved in disseminating information and trying to dispel misinformation. For the average person like listening to this that's consuming media, what's the smartest way to do that? Like, how do we find trusted news sources? What should we do? We got like a little 2 or 3 best practices or sort of practical tips you could share?
Jason, it's an enormous and absolutely terrifying problem. I think we've got to distinguish here between disinformation, which is the deliberate spreading of false information, and misinformation, which is just people sharing stuff that they haven't checked, that often isn't true. And that's the majority of it. There are bad actors, as you would call them, deliberately kind of trying to undermine our democracies and so on by spreading malicious content. But more commonly, it's just stuff that's slightly wrong. I would say you must only read trusted news sources and listen to trusted news sources. But, it's difficult because you look at some of the oldest media in the UK, and some of the stuff that they're churning out is I'm not sure it has an enormous basis in fact. So, in the UK, we do have impartial news sources that people know that they can trust because they have a team of journalists who know how to check facts. And fact checking is a huge amount of a journalist's job. So they're kind of there in between the massive information on the internet and you, the reader, and they're doing a really useful job. So it's definitely worth reading the stuff that they put out. I mean, I guess for you guys, it's the New York Times and other publications like that. But it is tricky, and I have my mother and various other people sending me articles that are definitely not true or verified news sources. I think it's a problem that only gets worse when people start getting their information from influencers rather than journalists who have no training at all in fact checking.
Stick to the journalist. Speaking of that, I want to, you have your everyday heroes, your first responders, your nurses, doctors, people that are on the front lines helping people day to day. And I include journalists in that, actually, because somebody needs to be on the ground telling us what's really happening in a place. And, this is a job where you can be killed for reporting news and reporting facts in some places. On that note, with the way some of the things you just described, the way sort of the internet has a tendency to churn out some clickbaity things, let's call them, or some less than fact-based pieces. What does the future of investigative journalism look like? I read somewhere in your bio that you spent about 5 years piecing this story together. And, this is these in-depth sort of like well thought out kind of like analytical, you're diving deep in multi-year process. Stories take multi-years. Like it takes time, and time is money. And it all comes down to the, sort of like economic growth and this need for economic growth, this is a whole other topic. But I'm just wondering, within the landscape today, what do you think is the future of investigative journalism? What does that look like?
I have huge admiration for what you call the first responder type journalists who get onto the scene and check out all the facts incredibly quickly and then put them out into the world. I think my way of working really is to handle facts with great caution and not to assume that what you first see is the entire picture. I think there is increasingly a role for investigative journalism, not only because there's so much noise now online that if you're a traditional news organization and you're just putting out short news articles, it's likely that that's just going to get drowned in a sea of content, because you have so many people who are basically citizen reporters. So if something happens, you'll have everyone on the scene has a smartphone and they'll be taking photographs. They're probably the first people to get to the scene of something, are not journalists. They're citizens, and so they're filling in part of that vital role that reporters used to do by alerting the public to something having happened, and what the impact of that thing looks like on the ground, whether that's the scene of a crime, whether it's a natural disaster, whatever that might be. And so for journalists to stay relevant and to use those skills for the public good, I think putting a lot of resources into a story that will cut through the noise, that will either kind of set the agenda, shape the discussion. I mean, there's ethical complexities around that as well. Like journalists, not just as the recorder of things that are already happening, but journalist who is identifying an area to investigate for X, Y, and Z reasons, and digging into that and making that a story of importance. You're seeing more and more international news organizations putting money behind investigative reporting. I think it's also important as our world becomes more complex, as our world becomes more international. It's an opportunity often for journalists to work across different countries. I mean, if you're looking at an international crime syndicate or a multinational corporation, then often you would need lots of people to work on a story to figure out what exactly is going on and how that company or individuals have become so powerful, and to hold them to account, often across multiple jurisdictions. And that really can only be done with teams of investigators. So I think journalism is evolving as our world is evolving, necessarily. And so I think increasingly there will be. I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. What is your advice for somebody listening who is tackling a big project, a big idea? It doesn't have to be in journalism, but I think I'm inspired by the fact that, your tenacity, to go out to have the conversations, to gather the facts, and then to spend years piecing it all together. How do you find the motivation to keep going over such a long period of time? What would be some like just from the process itself, from a process or creative process standpoint, seeing something through that's so big to the end and culminating in this book for you on the Shadow Tracks, A Journey Through Occupied Myanmar, which we'll mention one more time. Of course, we'll link up to in the show notes. Any advice you have to share for anybody looking to tackle something big like this?
I almost didn't finish it. I think in this instance, the thing that kept me going was that I had gone to these places where travel was ethically, it was a bit of a gray zone, and I'd taken up all of these people's time to ask them to recount things that were often quite traumatic. So I really felt like in the end I had a responsibility to write those stories up, because that was their expectation when we were having the conversations. So I really had a responsibility to do that. But I think more broadly, a project like this, like the steps of putting it together, they're so small and simple. Like in a way, it's quite repetitive. It's, in my case, it was go to a place, ask the same 5 questions, write your notes up, figure out how to piece all the pieces together. And I did that thing where I had little note cards that I arranged, with theme, person, interview, whatever. But it is very much fitting together all the small pieces of the puzzle, and each one was very doable. So I think you have to see it like that. I didn't know what was going to come out of this, so I had to have a short-term view of what I was doing, and then at the end of each bit, kind of reassess and go, okay, well, what are the next small steps? And in the end, yeah, the book came out of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's great advice, like you said. I mean, it's the small daily actions, and then combining that with the purpose-driven sort of, I guess, mentality. Like you have a strong purpose behind it, a strong why, and then the accountability, in your case, having these conversations and with their expectation that this story is going to see the light of day and it's going to get out to the wider world so people can understand what's been happening that in a small village that probably never would have had the chance to share if somebody didn't come along and offer them that chance. So the future of Myanmar, what's your take?
Gosh, that's a very hard question to answer. There's a poem that I was lucky enough to be able to reproduce at the end of my book by a Burmese poet who likens the revolution to a train. And she talks about not knowing what's ahead, but that there was no going back to the old station. And I think that now it's very clear that that's the case. There's always been conflicts in Myanmar's borderlands, and there have always been groups that have wanted to split off from the Burmese state. There have been times in the country's history where there have been revolutions that have pulled in civilians from across the country, but I think this is different. It's gone on for so long, and the territorial gains are huge and unprecedented. The military is in a very, very weak position. Whether or not it will fall and what the future of the Myanmar state would look like if that happened, I think that's a very open question at the moment, because there are a lot of different groups with different visions for how that might look. So for me to come out and say it's going to look like X, I think would be foolish. But that's where we are now, and the groups that are fighting Myanmar's military have no intention of giving up. But I think what we're seeing is that currently the military doesn't either. So, yeah, I'm going to be keeping a close eye on it. But I think it's too early to say what's going to happen.
2 last quick things, and let's just say there's a future where travelers can visit Myanmar safely, or whatever that means. I'm just curious, what would they find there culturally speaking? Or I just want to get your take on kind of like the people, what their spirit is like, the culture, and all of the sort of tragedy and everything aside, just taking that sort of trying to describe, hey, what is it like on the ground there when what are the people like? What's the culture like? I'd love to hear more.
The people are wonderful, and that is what kept me there for so long. Because after I wrote this book, I was gonna head off somewhere else or head back to the UK, and a Burmese friend of mine said, "I just started this publication. Like, will you come and work for me for a while?" And I did. At the time, they were doing some investigations, but also features. But over the time I was there, it evolved into this incredible investigative magazine that is still going, actually. They've just moved across the border to Thailand. And the young people who I worked with there were the most inspiring people I've ever worked with. They were so cool. And the jobs that they were doing, I mean, it required such bravery. But they were just so sort of open and kind, and I made some very deep and lasting friendships. They weren't just Burmese. As I've alluded to, it's a really complex country, and you have all these different cultures. I mean, the country is wedged between India, China, and Southeast Asia. And so culturally, you have this incredible mix. Up in the north, in the mountains, where it gets very cold at night, particularly in the winter, and you have this incredible diversity of cuisines and lots of very spicy foods, lots of cultures from the tribes in the far north that really do still live on in close to their sort of form before the modern Burmese state was formed. In the center, it's a Buddhist country, and social life often revolves around the monasteries. And you would wake up to the sound of chanting, and you have columns of young monks and older monks coming past your door with their alms bowls. It's a very communal atmosphere. People spend a lot of their time outside. Centers around the tea shops. So these are kind of places where you go and have your cup of coffee, your cup of tea, your snack, and people would spend long days there hanging out with each other. It's a relaxed place to be. And it's a very, very beautiful country as well.
I mean, tea. No British person's going to complain about hanging around and drinking tea all day, right?
Indeed,
well,
indeed.
Yeah, I do want to respect your time, but I have to ask you, how was it coming back to England after all of these experiences? How has it been resettling in your home country? Do you feel like it's home? How much of has things changed for you there being back?
It's a total culture shock. I think much more so than I was anticipating. The years had slipped by when I was in Myanmar, and in the end, because I'd started my career in Hong Kong, it had been 10 years that I wasn't living in the UK, and it is very different. I think one of the big things that shocked me was that people go to work from 9 till 5, and they might be working on something they feel very passionately about, but still they'll be like, okay, it's 5 p.m. I'm signing off, and I'm going to the pub, and I'm not going to think about it until I have to. And actually, I want shorter working hours and more benefits, and so on. And that was very different to in Myanmar, where for a lot of people it was existential. There's just been so many things that are so different. I think I have settled back in to life here. It's slightly hard to tell how much of that's culture shock. I've actually just had 3 children in a very short space of time, so it might just be broader shock relating to that and adapting to life as a mother, which is actually quite a wild adventure in itself. And also that has kept me from socializing in the UK in the ways that I normally might have done. So it's hard to disentangle those two things. But I will say that I miss it very, very much. There are so many small things, daily things that you just can't experience anything like it here. And that's hard. I suppose that's one of the things that happens when you go to different parts of the world and experience amazing things that when you leave, feels like something's missing. But I think it's probably worth it, even to have that as a result of it.
Congratulations on becoming a mother recently.
Thanks.
Yeah, I have 2 kids myself, so I know about the adventure. It's quite an adventure for sure. Feel free to share. I mean, obviously we mentioned the book, but I know you're doing some awesome work at Global Witness, I think you're with right now, which is a nonprofit. I mean, I don't know what you want to share here, but before we sign off, if you want to share anything around where people can find you, organizations to support, of course, the book On the Shadow Tracks, A Journey Through Occupied Myanmar, which we'll link up to. Anything else? Your website? Go for it.
Yep, cool. You can find me at clarehammond.net. Annoyingly, there's a really famous pianist in the UK called Clare Hammond, and she's got clarehammond.com. So if you find loads of photos of someone playing the piano, that's not me, unfortunately. My Global Witness work, we're just getting started on a whole bunch of things. So I'm not going to have anything coming out for a while, but that will probably be on my website. Organizations or places to support, send me an email. My email address is on my website. There's a few networks that I would recommend channeling support to, but they're a bit under the radar necessarily because of Myanmar's military. So send me an email and ask, and I'll send you the details.
Perfect. Thank you so much for doing this, and really appreciate your time and the work you've done, and hope we can stay in touch and have you back one time.
Jason, thank you so much for the great conversation.
Take care. There you have it. I want to thank Clare Hammond for stopping by the show. Of course, the book On the Shadow Tracks, A Journey Through Occupied Myanmar. I'm going to leave you with a quote to wrap this one up from Benjamin Franklin, the master of quotes, who said, "Half a truth is often a great lie." Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by ZeroToTravel.com. Ideas and advice to make your travel dreams a reality.